We're going to get started, even though we don't have a full quorum. It's not necessary. We don't have any action items. And in the interest of time, because we do have a little bit for Jerry to go over, we'll get started. So, Mikey, when we get the quorum, you can go ahead and take the roll.
Yes, sir.
I know Dr. Zacharias is on his way. And we'll delay the approval of minutes, and we'll go into item 3, which is review the draft 209-210 Audit Committee OIGC summary work plans. Derry?
If you will, Chair, and other members of our committee, Governor Stavros, Governor Temple. In your additional materials are just 3 short documents, including, if you'll take just a look before we begin, a document that has a copy of the agenda, also a copy of what I've labeled the Audit and Compliance Committee Work Plan Dashboard, and a copy of the PowerPoint presentation. So if you have those, also Governor Perez, I'll go ahead and begin. All right. As reflected in our minutes, which you've had an opportunity to review, and we will move for approval later, at the May meeting, the Board of Governors Audit and Compliance Committee.
Okay, Derry, we have a quorum now, so we'll go ahead and take the
Okay,
roll.
sir.
Mr. Edwards.
Right.
Mr. Martin. Mr. Perez.
Yep.
Mr. Stavros.
Here.
The Vice Chair is Mr. Temple.
Here.
Mr. Tripp, you do have quorum.
Okay. And let's take the approval of the minutes.
So moved.
And a second. All in favor say aye. Those none, show them approved. Okay, back to you, Derry.
All right. What I was getting ready to say, sir, that in reviewing the Audit and Compliance Committee work plan, I'm going to ask the committee to review this document. When we began our formal process pursuant to the charter that was passed back and approved by the full board back in March, it became apparent that it was necessary for us to have not only a work plan that was flexible, but also one that reflected the work and engagement of the board. Obviously, in this particular instance, we have, in the packet that you have, documents that reflect that. What I'd like to ask you to do is let me just very briefly go through what I've called the dashboard, because when the chair and I were going through this, and as I was going through my briefings, the work plan format that we have is somewhat, well, you have to really look down into it to see what the particular items are that are in our work plan that have a specific projected completion date. So the document in your small packet, which is a dashboard, includes those particular items that are in the Audit and Compliance Committee work plan that we asked you to approve today. And they also include the lead member of the Audit and Compliance Committee who will be responsible for supervising or monitoring our progress and getting them completed. So if you're looking at that dashboard, you'll see that I've just extrapolated those items that are clearly goals and deliverables that we submit our priorities for the committee for the upcoming year. I will point out the 2 that I'm going to also suggest are our highest priorities. Roman numeral 2, develop and approve the SUS compliance program. I'm going to talk about that in more detail later. And obviously, as is our requirement, to have an annual review of our work plan and also adopt procedures for monitoring universities' audit and compliance activities. Those I would submit are the highest priorities, and I'd ask you to review that. When we were going through this process before, you may recall I said that our role, that is staff's role, is to, of course, make sure that we have looked at both the authorities, the statute, the charter, the Constitution, to see if all of the activities, what I've sometimes called the to-dos, are included in our work plan. If there is anything else that you think needs to be included, I'd ask you to either comment on that now or you can contact me later. Any questions?
No, go ahead. You're doing fine.
One thing I would point out.
You have one break. That first item you need to do with John Temple.
Yes, sir.
He'll probably ask you to go to Hawaii with him this next month so he can work on that. You think you can handle that?
I think I might have a little bit of difficulty getting approval for that, sir. So it may not matter.
Governor trips paid.
Yeah. Anyway, the charter also mandates that we review the Office of Inspector General and Director of Compliance work plan. That is a denser document. It is in your materials, which you've had a chance to review previously. It's found, if you want to take another look at it, at the beginning of the materials on proper pages 12 through 19. I've described this before. This is a little bit denser document, but it became readily apparent that with all of the activities that we had, it would be necessary if we wanted to give someone a shorthand picture of what kinds of programs, activities, deliverables, tasks that we have, that we needed something that was a little bit more detailed than the Audit and Compliance Committee work plan. And in addition, it's a good planning tool for me and my staff, Ms. Lori Clark. So that document is also in your packet. The highlights there that I would suggest is that what became readily apparent during the year is that we had many activities, and I wanted to point out just one. If you'll turn just very briefly, see the chair is looking at me. Now, this is in your binder materials. I did not pull this out as a special document.
What page?
It's on page 12.
Okay.
This document reflects a fiscal year review of our work plan, so that's why there are fewer priorities and completed items there since our fiscal year began on July 1. What I wanted to point out that I submit to the committee and ask you for your approval, that our top priorities are the two, 1.2, which is develop a compliance program, and 1.4, develop a procedure for monitoring audit and compliance activities. In a sense, those sound like they're the same, but they are different. A compliance program that, as you're going to hear me talk about again later, for the SUS and also a compliance program for the Board of Governors may take some time. There are other issues. We must engage in detailed discussions with members of the state university system, and also there are going to be some issues that may have to come back before this committee. However, we have to develop a protocol for doing what the charter requires us to do. That is to maintain a look-see, a monitoring, a review of those activities that are going on, not just reflected in external audit reports by the Auditor General, but now under the powers and duties regulation, those particular findings that are in the internal audit reports. And I'll speak to that later. Those, I would submit, are our top priorities. With that, Chair Tripp, if there are any questions about that.
Any questions? Proceed.
Okay, that's good. See if I can load this up. Okay, we're ready. Yeah. Chair Tripp, other members of the committee, I have submitted to you that one of our top priorities is to go about the process of establishing a compliance program. What I want to do is share with you in this short PowerPoint presentation an abbreviated version of the training that we've undertaken with staff. One of the things that is absolutely necessary in order to get this done is to have not only your guidance, but what you feel are the first things that we should do. That's why I've always characterized the suggestions to you as, here's all of the things that we're supposed to do based upon the Constitution, applicable statutes that we need to adhere to, now the Audit and Compliance Committee Charter, but what do we do first? Simply put, it makes sense for us to focus on developing a compliance program for the SUS, for the state university system, and also one for the Board of Governors, which is a separate entity. That is what the charter says. So we've undertaken that process and have people working at it. And I want to take just a few minutes to go through, as I said, an abbreviated version of the training. During my conversations with the chair and also with Chancellor Brogan, it's apparent that we do not have unlimited resources. I want to commend the hard work of my compliance analyst, Lori Clark, but as the chair many times tells me, there are really only two of you. However, it is interesting and I think also important to note that even with just two people, if you leverage off of those individuals that you have available, those resources, including our other staff, you can make a difference, which is kind of our theme. Let me go forward very briefly. What is a compliance program? And again, I'm abbreviating this training. We've trained approximately 20 to 25 staff. We've asked them to become compliance analysts. That is, they are going to, as part of a regular detailed process, look at the Board of Governors regulations to determine not only what the requirements are that the board has mandated for the members of the state university system, but what are the requirements that the board has? What kinds of policies and procedures in particular do you have to implement to make sure that we are performing as the regulations require us to do? We've picked this as our top priority, and I'll explain later. Before we could engage them in that, I did three things at least. First, of course, I had numerous conversations with Chair Tripp. We waited to move forward with this until Chancellor Brogan was there, and in a series of conversations with him, making sure that we incorporated what he thought were the priorities and whether he felt this was also one where we should spend not only my time, but other staff time, and he agreed. So I'll just move forward. A program that's been reasonably designed to implement it and enforce so it will be generally effective. For most of you, this will be, quite frankly, a real broad refresher. For some of the folks who are on our staff who we're going to ask to do some of this work, I thought it best to give them a definition that can be used. What is key about this definition is that the program must evidence the due diligence in seeking to prevent and detect any violations of law. And you could include on that slide law, regulations, internal operating policies and procedures, whatever are those sources of authority and requirements that we have to comply with. What is a basic program design? Now, we have undertaken some research. We've looked at the compliance programs at other universities within our system, at compliance programs with other university systems and other universities who have, say, not a system kind of framework. But there is a very basic design. If you remember back, and I certainly can, to those days in the 1980s when the sentencing guidelines were first passed, there was an explosion in the public and the private sector in developing, as the definition indicated, a program designed to prevent and detect law. So there is now a body of, well, I will say, examples and good best practices for it. Here are just some of the areas that we would submit are the key areas and the basic design of the program. You have to identify risk areas, prioritize implementation in areas that are higher regulatory risk. I'll have a little bit more to say about that later. Of course, you have to do training. It has to be integrated. The word program means, and I've been asked this before, means that you have to have a systematic way of doing it. You have to have a process and procedure for preventing and detecting violations of those. You have to identify those risk areas, conduct assessments, and of course you have to look into new developments or requirements in the regulatory compliance. Obviously, those basic fundamentals, transparency, obviously being in sync with the mission and goals of the organization, and obviously encouraging and promoting the commitment to compliance with law. I put this slide in here because I knew you didn't want a long-winded discussion about the distinction between compliance and internal audit. But let me give you my shorthand version, the one that I've used in our training with some of our staff who may not have had as much experience as you have in here. Internal control is a term that has a specific meaning, and you can see from the slide, it is the process that you as a board, the chancellor as the chief operating officer and the one primarily responsible for implementing those policies, affects in order to make sure that the objectives of the organization are realized. Obviously, financial reporting, efficiency of operations, the one that, of course, is the subject of this presentation, compliance with existing law, are parts of the internal control systems. When I've been asked before, well, what's the difference, Derek, between compliance and internal audit? Well, I've sometimes fallen back on my usual definition. What is an audit? Well, an audit is an objective and independent review of what you have with a lot of standards and a lot of words. Now, that sometimes doesn't go over well. An audit looks at what are those internal controls, what is the actual activity and circumstance, where the organization has tried to implement them, and what's the gap in between. That's usually the finding in an internal audit. As compared with the compliance kind of setup, you're not only going to have that finding, you will have in place an organized way to correctively deal with those particular findings. It is a program function. It is effective in improving the operations of the organization. You can see these bullet points yourself. Corrective action is one that, of course, you've heard me talk about a lot. Now, the next slide, sir, and members of the committee, really are the direct quotes from our Audit and Compliance Committee charter. I wanted to just put that up on the screen. It's in your binder. That's why I included it in your materials. The charter that this committee and the board adopted requires us to not only receive and review university audit reports, but to identify trends in such reports. That is, trends that confirm and that those trends and adverse findings are being addressed by the respective universities. Also, if this committee deems it appropriate, it has a responsibility and is in the charter as required to look into whether appropriate responses to audit findings have been made by the universities. And lastly, and I'll speak a little bit about this when we move to my investigative activities or inspector general activities, this committee in the charter and the board approved has the authority to require and ask me to develop a protocol for looking into whether there is reasonable cause to believe a university is unwilling or unable to conduct an investigation. Let me put aside all the words and just talk to you for a little bit, because the next slide is kind of where we stand. What is the Brogan Doctrine? Now that the Chancellor is here, I can go forward with this, especially if I say anything that he says is not incorporated in that particular approach. What is the Brogan Doctrine? The Chancellor and I had a series of conversations. I've tried to articulate it in several ways, sometimes with a little bit of humor, but let me put it to you specifically. The Board of Governors has, specifically as an example in the powers and duties regulations, delegated responsibilities to the university boards of trustees to operate on the day-to-day basis and administer those universities. By doing so, however, we have not, the Board of Governors has not, and has reserved the fiduciary responsibility for the overall management of the state university system. And part of that fiduciary responsibility is to be able to demonstrate accountability. Now, I have tried to come up with a simple way of defining accountability. It is a much-used term. It is a fundamental term. But it can be defined as an ability to demonstrate by objective and empirical evidence that an institution or organization is actually achieving the goals and objectives. That's the Brogan Doctrine. How are we going to implement that? Well, if we're going to look at it in the context of a compliance program, we can start by simply identifying the project owner or champion. And in the training internally, what I've told folks, I'm not the champion. Chair Tripp, Chancellor Brogan, the members of this committee are the champion. An organization must establish that it is willing to actually put the time and effort into it, and you must have a champion who believes in that. That's why I felt it was essential, and of course the Chancellor agreed, that before we rolled this out, he had a chance to look at the charter, had a chance to bring to bear his particular views based on his experience and his responsibilities. Chair Tripp and I have had numerous conversations, as I have had with members of the committee about that. Now, this design incorporates that particular concept. It's fairly simple. And again, I wanted to emphasize at the beginning of my presentation, this is not the plan. This is just an overview, what I've given to staff. You have to identify key objectives, identify the key risk areas, and establish a systematic compliance program. In order to do that, one of the key elements in a compliance risk program, as you can see, that first bullet is to develop a compliance matrix. Now again, just in terms of general terminology, we wrestled with whether this particular graphic was a little bit too busy, but what is a compliance matrix? It's a grid. What are all of the sources of authority and those particular entities or organizations that affect your internal control system? What are the statutes, the Constitution, the laws? Over to the left of this graphic, of course, we have the Florida Constitution, and I want to point to you down below, BOG, internal operating policies and procedures. We, of course, have internal operating policies and procedures. Those are what we create. Of course, the charters, and as I've said during the training, and I will repeat to you today, the board speaks most effectively and forcefully in terms of implementing its policies through its regulatory process. It is a rigorous process that requires input from all members of the SUS and a regulatory process that ends up affecting the operations of the board and obviously demonstrating accountability. It did not take long in any kind of a risk assessment process to say, let's look at the regulatory framework by which the board operates. So in terms of external policies and procedures, of course there are some of those, but the BOG regulations, that is the Board of Governors regulations, there are approximately 90, some with subparts, is where we're going to start in developing this compliance matrix. Now, any questions so far? And I'm almost done too. Chancellor Brogan, do you want to comment on the Brogan Doctrine?
Not on the Brogan Doctrine, but the simple philosophy that stands behind, I think, assuring that both the local institution board is secure in the knowledge that they are overseeing a giant organization and have in place policies, practices, and procedures to assure that they're comfortable, that their fiduciary responsibility is being met. And of course, between federal audits, state audits, you see it on the grid, internal audits, as Norm knows because he sat in that chair position, it is a complex and complicated entity that that board oversees. And how do you oversee it and make sure that you can reconcile for the rest of your board members that they are meeting their fiduciary responsibility through that audit compliance system? And then again, as Derry mentioned, then we've got the Board of Governors, who also have a constitutional responsibility and therefore fiduciary responsibility for the entire system. Now, it is clear with one individual, that's why this is less difficult than perhaps the label Brogan Doctrine might conjure up. One person cannot audit the audits of the institutions. They're too voluminous, they are too great in number, and too complex for one person to go out there and audit every university's internal federal and state audits. Can't be done. So how do we assure for you, the members of the Board of Governors, that gigantic fiduciary responsibility you have for what I think is the fourth largest state university system in America is met? And back to Derry's point and what he's been working with Chairman Tripp on is developing a system to assure that universities, and believe me, they do, have in place their own Board of Trustee policies, practices, and procedures for appropriate oversight of federal, state, and internal audits, and develop a relationship with the Board of Governors to assure that is the case, and that on an annual basis certify that they indeed are carrying out appropriately those policies, practices, and procedures, and guarantee then that the Board of Governors can satisfy their fiduciary responsibility to that end. As Derry also mentioned, there might be those times where we can lend assistance or intervention or even perhaps investigation if in fact something bubbles to the surface that might warrant that kind of a look. But at the end of the day, we have a responsibility at this level, just as the Board of Trustees and the President have a responsibility at the local level, to have in place the best, most efficient system possible to assure at the end of the day that both boards, local and Board of Governors, can indeed meet that responsibility litmus test. And so what we've tried to put into place, and of course I'm doing the talking here, but between the chairman and Derry, we've tried to offer up to this board a system that will allow us to do that on an annual basis so that you can, as BOG members, feel comfortable that indeed you are annually satisfying that enormous responsibility that you've been provided. So, Chairman Tripp, that's kind of a poor man's take on it.
And one of the examples that we see is that when there is an issue, the legislature basically talks to us first. It doesn't matter. Anyway, we get the responsibility when they're mad. And while they recognize clearly the boards of trustees or the day-to-day people operating the presidents, it's clear, as we've seen in the past, if they have an issue, it comes right down on this board. Do we understand what the problem is? Do we have something in place to monitor it and take care of it? And it will always be that way. because they see us as the funnel of the money. You know, we put the budget in, the money comes to us, and there's always a question with them how much responsibility we really have. But in bad times, they don't want to hear that. They want us to have total and full responsibility and be totally and fully responsible for all compliance and other issues. So the only way we know we can do that, and Derry and I have had this talk, is we have to build a solid bond and relationship with each of the compliance and audit officers of the individual universities, because they really are the ones who know the issues and can make, you know, that work group is the only way we can be effective. Derry and one aide cannot, or one assistant or one partner cannot speak to all of that. So what we're trying to do and what Derry's trying to do is get our framework where everybody buys into what this is what we should be doing, and then it goes back to the universities and he starts building that partnership with them so that it flows.
Well said.
Is that?
Yes, sir. 2 points. First of all, this board, the universities that are a part of the State University System of Florida, have been doing compliance long before the sentencing guidelines were enacted back in 1988. They have embedded very aggressive, well-tooled programs in several areas. The obvious ones: research compliance, athletic compliance. Obviously, you have a compliance component in any HR department. So they have already been doing this. The fact that we are now going to develop, as Chair Tripp said, a framework for us to review that, to have a connection and a communication with that, is absolutely important. Second point, of course, part of my responsibilities in my first year, if not the major part of my responsibility in my first year here, was in what I have described as the most complex and challenging compliance project I've ever been engaged in my 30-plus professional career, and that was the FAMU task force. I saw some of my good friends from FAMU as I was coming in here. They took the responsibility to develop a compliance program that was complex, but only because of the issues involved. But also this board took on the responsibility to review that and make an objective and independent assessment that they were moving forward. We don't anticipate anything of that magnitude happening, but we have to have a framework in place, which is one of the reasons why we're working at it. So the universities have been working at this for quite a while, and that's one of the reasons, and the chair probably has concluded mine. I'll go through this very quickly. Compliance matrix, research, analysis. What is the added value in the project that we're talking about that is looking at the board's regulations? There are 2 or 3. First of all, we already have a spreadsheet that lists approximately 90 regulations and subparts. We're going to analyze that, and to borrow a term from my audit side of the house, we're going to do more than just what is the to-dos there. We're going to look at it at the functional level, do what I've described as a functional analysis. And the individuals that have heard my brief description in more detail in this particular instance and who will be responsible for that are also the folks who are responsible for implementing those policies and procedures. I submit to you that one of the added values from this process is that we will see where those functions are and go about dealing with some of those areas that we think need immediate attention. Now, how do we go about doing this? As we've said, we formed 2 work groups: the compliance work group, which is made up of the individuals whose titles are there. And I want to recognize very briefly, since we're here at being hosted by University of South Florida, that Debbie Gula, who is the University Audit and Compliance Director, and her Executive Director for University Audit and Compliance, Jeff Muir, and one of their other staff members are here. This group was formed last year. We've had numerous communications. We've met one time over the phone. We're going to meet in person later. They will be the primary avenue for us as we go through this process to look at some of those sticky details. When I was preparing for this, I tried not to use the devil is in the details, but we must have in place a framework, and some of those details are going to be sticky. I reference only the Audit and Compliance Committee charter process, which was cooperative and collaborative, but definitely was one that was intense and rigorous. These individuals are going to be available not only to look at what we're doing internally, but to look at some of those issues specifically and how we come up with a protocol for reviewing reports, both external and internal audit reports, and dealing with any issues that the board needs to review. Now, the internal box steering committee, you know the names of these folks. You probably already recognize the titles. I just didn't put their names on the PowerPoint presentation. Members of their staff, selected members of their staff, have gone through this training in a little bit more detail because, again, once I get rolling on this, I can go for a while. They will be responsible for organizing that. The Compliance Steering Committee, which is typical of how you go about in designing and implementing a compliance program, may eventually be the recommendation we'll make for our own Board of Governors compliance program structure, but we needed to get to work immediately on this map. Now, the last screen is, what are the tools? Well, I had a conversation with some of my colleagues earlier. We realized immediately that the old spreadsheet, and I was ready to just have carbon paper and facsimiles or whatever. The old spreadsheet was not going to be enough and not give us enough bang for the bucks. At a later meeting, I'm going to perhaps, especially if Lori Clark can join me, describe in more detail the access database that we developed in order to capture the information that we're talking about. The screenshot that I have here is just the user guide. But in essence, what we immediately recognize is that if we're going to have that many people working on it, we needed a little bit more, well, capability from a technological standpoint. Access will give us that. We've developed our own database. It's at the early stages. We're supporting it ourselves. But it will allow us to, of course, organize the data, manage the information, give us an opportunity to review it, and obviously, if you got this much information on the functional analysis of 90 or so regulations and subparts, be able to spot those areas that need perhaps immediate attention. Now, that's my presentation, sir. I'm open for any questions on this particular effort.
Any questions?
Mr. Chair, if there aren't any, because I want to give the members a chance first, but a comment, if you mind, I don't mind. And I'll end on this one. Judy, when we talk about what goes on in that classroom or that laboratory, that is clearly the most important thing we do at a university, is the teaching and learning component. No doubt. That is the runaway most important thing we do. And also the most exciting thing to talk about. At BOT meetings, at BOG meetings, we all get excited when we talk about what researchers are doing, what professors are doing, how students are engaged and involved on our campuses. And arguably the least exciting thing to discuss with a board of trustees or a board of governors is what we're talking about right now. Oftentimes I would tease Derek and say, talking about these things is about as exciting as watching somebody fish off a bridge. But at the end of the day, this arguably is the bottom line for any corporate board, whether it's the local board of trustees or whether it's the board of governors. If the boards cannot assure clear and distinct and appropriate oversight and monitoring of all things fiscal and all things possible, it puts our primary mission of teaching and learning in harm's way. And so while this is not the most exciting issue we deal with in education, and it probably isn't in any business, any good CEO and any good corporate board member knows it is the bottom line, because it is the bottom line. And so to that end, with the chair's leadership, we've really tried to, or are trying, because there, as Derry says, there are still miles to go on this thing, but good people working on it together, put in place both a local and statewide system that will assure appropriate oversight, monitoring, review, and if necessary, intervention when that is called for, that will allow our local boards and certainly this board to assure themselves that that bottom line is being seen after in the appropriate way. Ah, yes. This is what this man does for a living. He oozes enthusiasm, doesn't he?
Well, I just, since I have my colleagues from USF here, there are a lot of other folks out there just like me now. They just don't get an opportunity to come up and talk to you. But yes, this is extremely important, and I say it all the time. My energy is not feigned. It's
all right, your next.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
I don't know if it's the appropriate time to bring it up, but I know, and we had a lot of discussion about this when we put this charter together. Derry, have you looked at the backgrounds of the people on the committee and determined whether we have any financial experts?
We have you.
I know that. Well, and just looking at it myself, there's two of us that are clear. There's two that are maybe, in my opinion. One of them is either leaving or left. So I think you need to keep track of who you have, who might also be on the board. And have we ever told the governor's office that when he looks at making new appointments, that he should consider people that have, could be classified as financial expert? I mean, if we haven't done that, I would recommend that we do that.
Yes, I can probably address that, not with any specificity, but at least the conversation. When I spoke with the governor's office and they were telling me that they were reviewing lots and lots of people for possible board appointments, and by the way, both at the state level and at the institution level, because we have about 22, I believe, new BOT members to be appointed by the governor's office now, and that's in the pipeline. But that's one of the things I continue to talk about, is the importance of the corporate board. Sometimes that gets lost because we're in education, and I think sometimes people might lose sight of the fact that at the end of the day, this is a huge enterprise with significant amounts of money changing hands, and therefore the kind of people that you should want for a corporation, you should also want for boards of trustees and for the board of governors. And by the way, it is not mutually exclusive that because someone is a financial expert, they therefore can understand student issues and professorial issues, et cetera, and what happens in student life. But if you can find people who understand that but also understand the bottom line, you will serve us very well in terms of those appointments. So yes, sir, I've had that conversation.
I'm just trying to make sure we're in compliance.
Yes, sir.
Yeah,
in fact, you may recall.
And I think
Governor
with
Temple.
Gus sitting to your right and Tico, we probably we have a wealth of experience. I don't think we could ever hide under the rug and say we didn't understand.
Governor Temple, you pointed that out when we were going through the process, and the definition in our charter is consistent with the broad definition which is accepted. Now, having some more resources in that area, I'm all for it.
Governor Stevens.
We went through that. It was a little too tight before now.
Yeah,
Excellent.
Governor Stevens.
Mr. Chairman, one area, talk about compliance and violations. An area called purchasing. Having been a purchasing agent for about 10 years, it's an area you talk about the bottom line. We certainly, when you talk about audits and you talk about checking out the purchasing procedures, the methods, I've seen too often when I was president of the Purchasing Association that people found ways of violating the law. And I think that, in my opinion, that's an area, when you talk about audits, that purchasing department, the purchasing procedures have got to be constantly viewed.
Thank you. Derry, which item are you going to now?
Sir, I'm going to go to the next to last item, which is 4 and 5, and I think I can do that very briefly. 5 is discussion of Inspector General activities, and then all we have to do is look at our meeting schedule, and we're done.
Go ahead.
I wanted to just briefly describe a little bit about the activities. In your binders are copies of the annual report, which the statute which is applicable to my office requires. That annual report is on page, the one that I want you to look at begins on page 45 in your binder, not in the packet, and page 46. Very briefly, at the present time, even with our current staffing levels, we review all operational and financial audits that are issued by the Auditor General. We engage in discussions with both internally with staff and also with my counterparts at the universities about them. Since the powers and duties regulation now requires a submission of internal audits produced by, or final audits that are produced by the internal auditors at the universities, those will be coming to us. We're still working on a protocol for receiving those. That's a significant amount of information. In addition to that, we receive financial audits from all of the universities, direct support organizations and athletic organizations. We review those. We have a fairly, what I would call, fundamental kind of checklist to determine if there are any internal control findings in particular, much less if any of the DSO financial statement audits indicate that the opinion is anything other than an unqualified opinion. Now, that is a lot of data and information. What we're going to be doing in the next few months is working with our partners at the universities to come up with a protocol, make sure are we getting the information that we need, and do we have a way of identifying those trends, et cetera, and presenting any information to the board that is necessary for you to act upon. As the chair has said, that doesn't mean that findings in operational audits, financial audits, et cetera, won't generate questions. What we've tried to do internally on the compliance side is work with the staff when they're trying to develop policies and procedures. The tuition differential one is one that I'm going to at least be assisting as we go through trying to get those policies and procedures developed over time. We have a procedure in place. In addition to that, we have had the opportunity to consult and also provide some assistance as we went through internal at the board staff level, the development and implementation of certain policies and procedures, especially in the institutes and centers area. That was one where the Institutes and Centers program, and Dottie and Richard Stevens are very, very familiar with that, instituted a review of their procedures in implementing the Institutes and Centers regulation. We commented on that, tried to provide assistance as they worked through the details of making some changes to that. That's the kind of activity that we're engaged in each and every day. You receive the annual report, which the statute requires I submit on September 30th. It's a fiscal year report. I'll keep you updated on those activities as need be. I did want to point out, though, that most of the goals and deliverables that we had at the beginning of that fiscal year we completed. Of course, there's still a lot more to be done. All right. Sir, other than asking for approval to move forward with the work plans as drafts are indicated, that's the end of my presentation, unless there are questions.
Excuse me. Yeah, the only issue that that we've had is that Gary is trying to work with each of the universities so there can be an understanding of what types of materials we'd like to receive and when we'd like to receive those. And I think you're, for the most part, getting cooperation.
Yes, sir. And I want to add, too, and I may have flown past this too quickly. The responsibility that the charter sets forth for me to conduct a review if we receive complaints also takes up a significant amount of my time. I've received outstanding cooperation from the universities. We still need to formalize that process. I've used the term preliminary inquiry, which is consistent with what's in the charter and the statutory articulation of that. My objective, and I believe it is going to be realized, is to be of some value to the universities, because sometimes these matters not only are sensitive, but they've created some degree of serious work already, even if the individual comes to us with their complaint. Many of those, in fact, the vast majority, are just referred back to the university for their handling. Some of them require a little bit more review. Right now, the protocol, as is listed in our work plan, is for me to communicate and keep the chair engaged, or keep Chair McDevitt and now Chancellor Brogan engaged. If I come to any conclusions that need to come before the board, they would be the first ones, or if any of you happen to come across any matter, I can communicate directly with you. That was it, my last one. I'm done.
Yeah, and just for the board's committee's information, there are a number of things that are brought to our attention, and Derry, the first thing he does is he goes back to the university where that question is emanating from, and tries to review to see, are they dealing with it? Do they know about it? And what process are they going through? Because we do not want to take over any process that is being handled by the university. And sometimes they continue to keep us involved in it. So you know, it might be a professor who's upset or something, and they're contacting us. Excuse me. So we have to stay involved to that extent. But our involvement, for most of our involvement, we try to be involved in the sense that we're just making sure that the process is being followed, that the complaint is being taken care of, and we're not. It's not our purpose to second guess the outcome. anytime. You know, sometimes they don't like the outcome, but it's the university's privilege to make that outcome how they see fit with it. And so we've had a number of those, and Derry's dealt with them, I think, to everybody's satisfaction, so that we...
So far.
So far.
So far, so good.
Okay. Is there anything we need...
The only other item on the agenda, sir, is, of course, the adoption of a meeting schedule. And I'll just reference back to our charter. The charter requires, and that's something that we need to amend and edit, that we meet at least 4 times. As the chair has said to me several times, and I think you would agree, we should meet only when it's necessary. So that's one of the minor changes that we need to make to the charter as we go through the review process this year. But here is a suggested meeting schedule, which is consistent and with the meeting schedule for the Board of Governors. So,
and we may be able to have a phone meeting, you know, depending on what the issues are. If we don't have any issues, then, you know, we don't need to have the face-to-face. But is everybody okay with this schedule?
Mr. Chair, is it appropriate to move adoption of the work plan as presented
yes,
by
sir.
Harper?
Yeah. Is there a second to that? Second. Any discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Okay, your work plan is adopted. Meeting date, we don't have to have a motion for that, but we have any questions on that? If not, we'll work that as being our meeting schedule.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Any other questions of Derry? You're doing an excellent job. We appreciate all the hard work, and thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, sir.
Meeting's adjourned.
I need to find out what Chester wants to do about the schedule, so let me take a little break here a minute and let you start. And I need to round up so we can get the rest of your program.
Yeah, well,